Welcome to the final Hyde Lecture of this fall semester under our series, Our Work, Your Work, Designing and Planning for Political Engagement, in which we're seeking discourse on the consequence of our practice on the built environment for future generations. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you Graeme Brooker. Professor Brooker is the head of interior design at the Royal College of Art in London and has published widely on a variety of aspects of the interior and in particular reuse of existing buildings. His recent publications include Adaptations and Key Interiors since 1900. He has co-edited 8 books on the interior with Sally Stone, including the highly acclaimed Rereadings, and my personal favorite, in collaboration with Lois Weinthal, the Handbook of Interior Architecture and Design. He is also the founder and director of Interior Educators, which is the National Subject Association for all interior courses in the UK. And his current publications include Brinkworth, So Far So Good, and The Story of the Interior, which is due out this coming year. This afternoon, Professor Brooker is going to speak to us on Radical Heritages, and so please join me in welcoming Graeme Brooker.
Okay, hello. Okay, let's better start with a bit of housekeeping, I think. Some thank yous. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Nate, thanks to the guys for bringing me all the way out here to come and speak to you. It's a real pleasure. And thanks ever so much for allowing me to sit in on some of your reviews today. That's going to fall off, isn't it? It's always, I think, a nerve-wracking moment for hosts when somebody comes from the outside and you let them loose on your work of your students. And so I always take that as a great honor, and thank you. It's always a pleasure to see great student work, etc., which I saw today. So thank you very much. Another little note. It's Friday afternoon. It's 4 o'clock. You can fall asleep if you so desire. You can start to hopefully enjoy this lecture, but whatever, we're going to have a bit of fun, I think. So if you want to do a Mexican wave over there, I'm joking, you don't have to. Oh, there we go, there's one. I'm going to show some work, that's my students' work, work from other people as well, just to illustrate a whole bunch of ideas and talk to you a little bit about this idea of radical heritages. I'd also, if you are keen, the only social media I use is Twitter. And if you want to tweet me or listen to any more of my inaneness, that's my name on Twitter. So please add it, and then you can keep in touch with all the old rubbish that I come out with. For those that don't know me, Nate did a great intro there. Thanks, Nate. A little bit about me. I never know whether anybody's going to introduce me or not, so I tend to over-egg this a little bit, but bear with me. My work is primarily about the interior and always has been. I'm educated in the interior, practiced in the interior, and I write about the interior, which is one of the main things that I do. And primarily all of this started because when I was a student, there was pretty much no books on the interior. It was quite often about architecture with just something going on the inside, and that used to frustrate me. And when I started teaching, quite a few years ago now, students used to say to me things like, well, where are you getting this stuff? Where are these ideas coming from? Where are these projects? And so I started writing about them. And so I suppose my journey over the last, I've been teaching for about 20 odd years now. I know that's hard to believe because you're thinking I'm probably only 25. It's been about defining the territory of the interior, talking about the history, the theory of the subject, notions around often people consider the interior as just an inside thing. Well, it's not, it's also an exterior thing as well. So ideas about the city as an interior. And of course, particularly about reusing existing buildings, which is what I'm going to talk about primarily today. And essentially my job for a number of years has been as an advocate for this discipline, but also really with other people, defining the field and talking about what we do and how we do it. That's manifested itself primarily in teaching and research and book writing, and some of those books are here. And this is a blatant attempt to remind you that it's Christmas and you all need to buy yourself gifts. Thank you. What's the title of this talk, Radical Heritages? Well, I really responded to Nate's. I get quite a few invites to come and talk to places, and sometimes I just either can't make it or it sounds like a long journey for maybe not much to do. But Nate's provocation about politics and about the idea of space and how the politicization of space, which was how I read the provocation, I thought was really interesting, and it really appealed to me, and it made me think a little bit about, well, what's this kind of, how does this manifest itself in any of the work that I do and we do with the students? So I'd like to talk a little bit today about this idea of radical heritages and what it might mean and of what it's, what use it might be to any of us. Let's talk a little bit about heritage. Heritage is a great word. I'm also an obsessive about language. I came to language rather late, and so therefore I've become kind of slightly nerdy about it, and I like to look words up in dictionaries, particularly the etymological dictionary, because I think you kind of find the root of words and where they're coming from and what they're trying to say. Heritage is a great word, and of course it's a Latin term, or it derives from the Latin and Old French, hereditary, or heritage, which essentially means to inherit. So there's no great surprise there. It's derived from hair, and I don't mean the stuff which I once had on my head, but I mean as in your relatives, your heirs. And it's obviously closely connected to the inheritance of things. So bear that in mind throughout this talk. Heritage, inheritance, the things that we take or we gather or we collect from relatives, from the past, and we kind of take forward. And of course, the font of all knowledge, Wikipedia, says, cultural heritage is the legacy, and I quote, who wrote this, who knows, is the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a group or society that is inherited from past generations. Not all legacies of past generations are heritage, and this is the killer line. Rather, heritage is a product of selection by society. So what Wikipedia is saying, and everybody believes Wikipedia, don't they, is that heritage is a quality of selection. Heritage is a quality of decision, judgment, etc. And I think that's quite interesting, especially in regards to what we're going to talk about here. There's different types of heritage. There's tangible heritage, and this relates to artifacts, things, and tangible heritage can be movable or immovable. So, there's all these kind of categories of heritage. Once you start looking into this, it becomes quite interesting. Movable heritage is things like paintings, books, clothes. Immovable is buildings. Quite often, not always, but quite often, they don't move. Monuments, places. And then there's intangible heritage, which is memories, stories, customs, beliefs, traditions, behavior, and so on. So, heritage has these kind of wonderful catalogues of ideas, movable, immovable, tangible, intangible. Why is heritage important to us, and why is it important to this discussion today, especially to the designing political engagement, as in Nate's provocation? Well, heritage is an idea, I think, which, since its inception, describes how we pass things on and reinforces patterns of behaviour, let's say. Heritage is about how we kind of hand things down through the ages. It's a changing thing, so one might argue that there's periods where inheritance is very important to us and heritage is very important to us. And then there are periods, maybe, one might argue in something like the 20th century, the early 20th century, where heritage was not so critical, and rather than retain and hand down, things such as buildings may well have just been demolished and dropped and got rid of, etc. Peter Sloterdijk, the philosopher, talks of disinheritance in this case, where generations grow up, and he argues actually that you guys, you young youth sitting in the audience there, that you are a generation of disinheritance because of the political systems that you live in and the dominant kind of ideologies that surround us all at the moment are very much ones about individualism and not necessarily about society. So therefore, disinheritance is actually critical. We want to reject previous generations. You want to say no to stuff being handed down or forced upon you, or values, and disregard these things. So it's a pretty complex thing, right? Heritage. In essence, it's a really problematic idea. What do we inherit? Why? Who chooses what we inherit? What we conserve, what we preserve, what we rehabilitate, what we demolish. It's big stakes, and you know, heritage is a really complicated issue. Why is that important to us? What's the point? What's he rattling on about? Well, again, I ask, why is this important for us as interiors people? Why is this lecture called so? And how does this respond to Nate's designing political engagement? Well, my work as an educator and as a writer always has foregrounded an approach to thinking about and making the interior in a way which foregrounds what we have inherited, the heritage of things. And what I mean by that is I am fascinated, obsessed with how the interior can be considered to be a product, an object, a space, an environment, whatever you want to call it, which is as a result of an agglomeration of all kinds of existing matter. So it's a kind of composite. And one might argue that the interior is naturally, in that condition, an article of heritage, because it contains values, stories, tangible things, intangible things, movable things, non-movable things, which are all part of an existing site, compacted down quite often, sometimes lost, sometimes very clear, but those are all the things that are already there. And if you consider the interior, which I do, and whether you're an interior architect, interior designer, interior decorator, I don't care what you call yourself, it doesn't matter. Your job is to work out these messages and to decide and edit, suppress, emphasize these messages, this heritage. The work I show you here is some of my students' work from the last couple of years at the RCA. And whether we are working in a space, so this is a project which is the reuse of an old coaling pier in the River Thames by JG. This is, he turns this building into a mudlarking museum. For those of you who don't mudlark or don't know what mudlark is, it's a long story, but it's brilliant. We spent 2 days on the Thames, digging the Thames. The Thames in London is one of the greatest archaeological sites in the world because everything for centuries was thrown into the river. So it's a big waste pile, really. And the tide is so strong that twice a day it scrapes out all of this stuff and deposits it in different places. And there are mudlarkers, which is a very, my brother is a mudlarker, so there's a very ancient society of strange people who go digging on the Thames. So the project there was about how do you reuse this bit of heritage, this old pier, which was used for barges to deliver coal to Greenwich Power Station. What do we do with this thing? You know, we don't want to demolish it, we're going to reuse it. So whether it's reworking heritage, whether it's working with the existing, whether it's when I was a visiting professor in Milan for 3 years, and I thought, well, what's the heritage of this city? Well, Milan, Italians, it's food, isn't it? So we did a project called Edible Translations, which was make your city out of food, which was great fun. A Parsons exchange project. We had a workshop with Parsons for a couple of years where we'd do a week in New York and a week in London on the same project. And I wrote a project which was called Protest Site, and essentially a very brief brief, which was, you've got Trump, we've got Brexit, spatialize it. And that was it. And this was a great project, which was the Trump Wall in Manhattan, made out of polystyrene, which nobody got arrested for, brilliantly, but we thought it was rather amusing because these things people just kept kicking them over all the time and wellying them and stuff like that. And we thought, yeah, that's what happens to a Trump wall. Anyway, the point being is that I like to think that all the work I do, whether it's in Milan, New York, wherever, is about heritage. It's about inheriting, and it's about the existing, what's there, and how we manipulate it. My work has always been in interiors, and therefore it's always been about building reuse and reusing and adapting what's there already, and that's something that I've always pushed with my students. This is some student work from just the last couple of years, a student show of ours. And my argument always is, whether you are working on an existing building that actually is built, or whether you're working, somebody gives you a line on a page or on a screen on a computer in an office, you're always working with something that's there. And that's one of the distinguishing factors of the interior. And that's something that we always constantly talk about as interior designers. And and this is the bit where I annoy the architects in the room. Everybody says they do it, of course. Everybody can do the interior. It's not a problem. It's easy, isn't it, etc., etc. Well, it kind of is. But I would argue that I don't know any schools of architecture, programs of architecture, that spend their 3, 4, 5 years, 7 years working with existing buildings all of the time. All the interiors programs I know around the world, that's all they ever do. They rework existing spaces. So on that basis, I always argue that the interiorist, i.e. the interior architect, designer, decorator, is the great expert in this field. That's my view on it. And from that, you develop a very particular sensibility, which I think most interiorists have. Not all of them. Some architects do, some landscapers do, of course. Many people do. But I would argue that this sensibility is crafted and honed through years of working with the found. So what does radical heritages mean for me? Well, the last few years, I run a platform as well as running the program at the RCA, I run a platform. And a platform is a small teaching group. It's not an architectural unit. We avoid those. They're a bit too territorial. We have platforms, and platforms are open-ended things which we teach across and we work with each other. Mine's called Interior Reuse, and for the last couple of years I've been working with small groups of students where I take a very particular project and we look at the project and we start to work out what the hell that means and how do we work with this existing stuff. This film you're seeing before you is our project last academic year. We have a different one this year. This is Clarendon Park, which is in Surrey, which is just southwest of London. Clarendon Park is a stately home, Palladian, 1820, late 18th century actually, 1780-ish started. And as you can see from this wonderful film, it was unfortunately burnt to the ground in 2015. My project, along with the designers who were doing this, Allies and Morrison, we essentially attach ourselves to whoever's working on these projects as a sort of research and development gang. Our project here was taking this building and just saying, what does heritage mean in this project? What is this building for in the 21st century? We know what it was for in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, but now it's been torched, and as you can see, it's pretty much devastated, although, in its ruinous quality, it's absolutely devastatingly beautiful, I think. What do we do with this sort of stuff anymore? Do we just demolish it? Do we turn it into a Starbucks? Do we just forget it? And that was essentially the brief to my students. So we work with the National Trust, we work with Allies and Morrison. My students spent about 9 months in their master's thesis project working on this building. Their response to it, well, it really varied, and this is a small group of 6. And Radical Heritages here was really their kind of way into this sort of material. What do you do with this stuff? And the material of this existing building was amazing because in its ruined state, there was still huge amounts of paneling, statues. Some of the paintings and stuff were rescued before it completely kind of fell apart. So the start of the project was called The Threshold, and it was about students each taking a room of this mansion, which essentially was now a sort of 3-4 story volume because all the floors and the roof had fallen in. And I was tasking them with the sort of early brief to look at the threshold in this space. And it was a really nice way in because it immediately engaged the student with the material of the project. They needed to understand the stuff that was there, which is very, very important. And that led to a whole series of ideas which emerged throughout the project, ranging from some students decided, essentially I was saying to the students, what do you think about this stuff, So a lot of them were saying, do you know what, demolish it, leave it, let it ruin, let it rot. Others were saying, no, let's kind of cover it up and use it as something. Others were saying, I want to reinstate this or I want to reinstate that. So we had a really great sort of year of conversation, which, you know, when you think about it, if you boiled it down, it kind of, we talk about preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, all of those things. We kind of went beyond those, really. So we had things like, Yukai's project was to put a big kind of container over the thing and use this building as a kind of restoration lab. So it's about people coming to learn about masonry and about paneling and stuff like that. We had Jackie's project was about letting the building rot and creating a series of follies out in the landscape. The landscape around the house is really beautiful and it contains a series of little follies. And Jackie decided that the building itself should become a folly. We had people reinstating the library, we had a sculpture gallery. One of the students, Eli, found in the fire a whole series of witch marks were revealed as the panelling came off of the building. Now, witch marks are really powerful, interesting things. You can't see it here, but it was just about around there. When the masons were making the building, they would put imprints above things like windows and doors and chimney breasts, openings into the rooms. And those marks were designed to ward off the evil spirits. And then they got covered up with the timber paneling and stuff like that. So when the fire happened, it obviously revealed all of those things. So her project became a story of the witch marks, and there was an exhibition in this ruined building to show us all about the story of witch marks. I'll be talking a lot to you guys today and some of the staff here about our processes at the RCA. We're obsessed with thinking through making, so we always get our students to model. I asked some of the students earlier about model making and why they didn't have any models, and it's because we're obsessed by it. So our students, it drives them nuts, you know. This was in halfway through the project, we made a 1 to 20, I don't know how that translates in Imperial actually, 33 1/3 or something? Not sure. Anyway, it's a scale model of one of the rooms and it's huge. Each of these models are probably about, oh God, I was going to say a metre then, but you don't even know what that is. Probably about 4 foot high, I suppose, each of these rooms. And it was designed to tease out the real responses to the students' work. This is a little show we have halfway through the year called the Work in Progress show. So the work is about thinking through making. Our students repeatedly make and model, and through that process, stories and the designs emerge. This was the follies in the landscape. This was halfway, so it's not complete. This is one of my students decided that the building should become just a ruin, and then because it was inspired by Palladio, he built a kind of corner of the Basilica in Vicenza by Palladio in the corner of the ex-Palladian villa. So it's kind of like Palladio in Palladio, if that makes sense. And then we had things like Wunderkammers, which were bringing back all of the fragments and stuff, etc. This was probably the best project, I think, which was the Follies project. There's one of the main rooms of Clarendon Park is the Marble Hall, and it's a beautiful thing, and it's renowned for its proportions and geometry. And Jackie became obsessed with this, and he started analysing it, and then he formed a series of follies within the parks. Each of these images are about 6 foot high, and each of these follies were essentially rooms that are then externalised, and you were designed to you were meant to interact with them before you then went to the main building. So it was a nice project, successful. This guy, we're very lucky with where we are in terms of our students get snapped up super quick. So this guy's in Japan now, working with Kengo Kuma. Anyway, I digress a little bit. So in teaching, I suppose is the point I'm trying to make. Radical Heritages for me was the project, but also opened up a whole bunch of questions about building reuse and about the inheritance of buildings. And obviously, if we're talking about the interior as a process of working out what's already on site, then the notion of heritage and inheritance becomes incredibly critical. And I think you can see in some of those images, that's what we were about. Developing the theme a bit further, if you, kind of follow the line of thought of the interior being about what's on site, then that changes the history of the interior, in my view, completely. And what I mean by that, I'll give you a bit of backstory. Nate mentioned that I'm working on a book called The Story of the Interior, and this is a history book, which is killing me because it's the most scariest thing I've ever done, because it's essentially a retread of, you might not know this, but there's a very famous fine art book by Ernest Gombrich called The Story of Art, published by Phaidon, and I've been commissioned to write the story of the interior, and that sounds all straightforward, I hear you say, but the thing is about the Gombrich is he sold about 8 million copies of this thing worldwide, and it's pretty big shoe. It's in something like its 20th edition, so it's pretty big shoes to fill, so I'm petrified. So I've spent ages trying to work out what the story of the interior is. One thing I'm convinced by is the story of the interior is not the story of architecture. They're radically different. Why? Because just because the interior is often on the inside of a container, that doesn't mean it's anything to do with the architecture in which it's contained, I would argue. So there's all kinds of different narratives about the interior. And if you think about, you know, if I'm arguing or suggesting that the interior is about building reuse, primarily, chronology goes out the window. I can't just write a history where I go, oh, there's the cave, there's Gothic, oh, Georgian, oh, here we are today. You can't do that, because if I remake a building, if I put let's say, a bank inside an old Gothic cathedral, or if I put a bar inside a kind of 1960s frame building or something, then what happens to chronology then? It doesn't make much sense. So you can't just be chronological about the history of the interior. It doesn't make sense. It's not a linear chronology. One thing is important is, and these are things that I've been writing about, is a historical process called spolia. I don't know if you know about this, but this is an archaeological term, which is about fragments being reused in antiquities to make new spaces and new buildings. And here on the left is, for me, one of the greatest examples of this. This is the pulpit of Torcello, just outside of Venice. And it's an object made out of elements fabricated from completely different places and completely different times. And if you imagine this was something like the 12th century. If you imagine that, the bars of Diocletian, Lotek, even Divit Carlin, the whole idea of us reappropriating fragments to make something new, spolia, is a way of making interior. Spolia is a great word. It means essentially the spoils of war. When Roman generals used to beat somebody in battle, they used to take all of their shields and swords and stuff like that, and they used to normally plaster them all over their houses to show how good they were, and that's the spoils of war. And that's what spolia means. There's strands of archaeology which concentrate on the history of kind of spolia, because I describe it as a kind of a process, an archaeological process, which is almost like a process for recessionary times. When the Romans didn't have any money, when they couldn't go out and pillage and attack and forge an empire, they turned in on themselves, and they would remake their monuments out of the existing monuments. And so there's a great study of the Arch of Constantine in Rome is one of the great spolia monuments, because it's made out of entirely different elements from different monuments in Rome. Anyway, that is a kind of approach to history which I think is partly in the story of the interior. It's really important that we kind of talk about stuff from other places. Heritage is an approach that I think is underlying all of this stuff. Okay? It's an approach that's critical to the built environment because, you know, as interior people, we intervene into things all of the time. You know, stuff that's there already, we're kind of being asked to make a judgment on it, a value. We're going to be critical about it. As well as that, I also think that this approach, this idea of reusing stuff, is ultra modern. It's pretty much what I think the 21st century is about. And what I mean by that is, you know, whether you like it or not, and there may be some people in the room who aren't very happy with this, but climate change is happening, I'm afraid. And the notion that we can just carry on utilising resources in the way that we have done before, I would argue is no longer possible. I was in a conference a couple of years ago. There was a guy there talking about the future of the built environment. He was a futurologist, and he said to a packed room of principally architects, I think, really, in 30 years' time, there'll be no more new build. How do you feel about that? And there was a hushed silence, kind of a few murmurs of discontent, etc. I kind of follow that line, really. And so that's right, surely. New build is resource hungry. We spend a lot of time dropping buildings and then building something on top of that, etc. So we've got to think about how we reuse what's around us. And that connects us to not only just heritage, it connects us to ideas about waste and waste production and what is waste, circular economies, looping, all of those things. I'm sure you've heard these terms before, the sustainability agenda. And as I say, it's particularly of its time. You probably can't read these quotes, but, in the last 6 months, very, very well-known journalists talking about what the hell are we doing? Why aren't we focusing on reuse? Why aren't we focusing on working with stuff that is already around us? So I'd argue that the interior is really about the 21st century and beyond, I think, if you primarily associate it with building reuse. I don't know whether you talk about this here in the States, but in 2018 in the UK, single use was designated the word of the year, and that's obviously in direct relation to these things, plastic and plastic bottles, etc. But it's important because no more, single use will be regulated out of existence very soon, I think, really. So that will apply to buildings as well, I would estimate, in the next 2 or 3 years. You cannot design a building just for one use anymore in terms of its future. You have to think about what it will be turned into in 10 years' time, etc. So everything is with us, is what I'm saying. Everything's already out there. Imagine that. You might not agree with me, but everything's already with us. It's just a matter of how we're going to remix it and rework it. And that's what we need. So radical heritages. How does the interior, therefore, as a site of reuse and as a site of maybe political engagement in response to Nate's provocation, I would argue that radical heritages is a provocation to you lot to think about your waste, but also to think about how the interior is heritage. It's heritage as a composite, as an amalgam of stuff. And it's the way then that we navigate all of those meanings and we edit them, suppress them, we think about new ways forward with them. That's the critical thing for the 21st century. Rather than just demolishing and dropping stuff, we've got to think about how we rework this stuff and how it becomes something new with new meaning. Now, for the next part of this talk, I'm going to try and outline ways forward with that. I'm not just going to leave you with that, how do we do this kind of thing. I'm going to try and outline some of the things that I've been doing with my students to try to work our way forward. And I think one of the underlying things that I can kind of leave you with, or at least try to make you think of, is ways of working with the existing, stuff that's already out there. I constantly talk about strategy with my students, and strategy as an activator of the existing. Strategy's a really good word, I think. And again, I don't want to kind of paint myself into a corner, but I was at Kent State a couple of days ago and I was talking to some students and they were describing their work to me and they kept sort of being a bit hesitant about something, and I was like, what are you saying? And they said, well, we didn't like to say the word concept. And I was like, why is that? And they said, well, we hear that you don't like it. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. Where did you get that from? And I think what it is I have done a few talks where I've said, oh yeah, concepts, what the hell are those things? It's kind of true. I much prefer the word strategy to concept. Concept is when I ask a student what their concept is and they say, well, it's like this, Graeme, it's the moon circles around the sun and then there's the planet Earth and then that's the concept. Right, here's the space. It doesn't mean anything to me, it's too abstract. I'm much more of a fan of strategy. Strategy for me is an action. It's a responsive approach to what you're doing. And when you're working with the existing, it's absolutely critical because it's a thing that gives us an action. It's a response. It immediately allows us to kind of engage with the stuff that's there already, which is hugely important when you're working with stuff that's there already. When you're working with heritage, let's call all of this stuff heritage, i.e. the existing, the material that you're going to be working with is already ingrained in that space. It's embedded in there. And that can be tangible, i.e. it's there, it's solid, you can lick it, you can smell it, you can poke it. And it's also intangible, stories, memories, histories, customs, etc. And that composite of material is something that you as a designer need to unlock, that you need to act upon. And that's why strategy over concept, for me, is actually much more useful as a device. It's an instrument which allows you to surgically start to dig around and open up and to somehow express and emphasize and suppress other things as well. So strategies are really critical, and in most of the publications that I do, process-based stuff anyway, I talk about strategies all of the time because, again, I think that one of the the areas of difference for the interior, the thing that sets us apart from maybe other built environment subjects, is the ability to talk about strategy because we're working with the existing stuff that's already there. So strategy is an instrument, it's a device, it's a way of acting, of responding to what's there already. Again, like the nerd that I am, I like to look these words up. So when you look up the word strategy in a dictionary, well, there's some really nice kind of ways of describing it, much better than I could ever say. Strategy, a clever or careful plan, the art of military planning, movements and operations. I love that idea that somehow when you make a strategy, you're kind of responding to your enemy. You're in war, and they've moved their troops over there, and they've moved their cavalry there. So you've got to kind of move your troops that or that way or that way. It's a kind of a responsive gesture in war, which I quite like the idea of. But the second one is even more beautiful, the skill in devising expedients. Wow, that's such a beautiful phrase. Expedients. To be expedient is to kind of expect something, and you're kind of responsive. Expedience is all about being responsive to something. So strategy is those things. It's about working with the stuff that's there already. So it's critical. It's a device. It's contingent. It's all kinds of things. It's a way of working with what's there. It's a way of unpicking, unlocking. It's a way of kind of really getting to grips with the material that's in front of you, the found material, the site, the matter that's before us, whatever you want to call it. And there are many words that you can call it. It's all there. And strategies are the activators. They are the actions upon which you then enact upon the existing. You marshal, you organize, you plan, you are expedient, you develop contingencies, all of those things, because you never quite know how this battle's going to go once you start to unlock what you found or what's in front of you. And as I say, for me, that's a much stronger way into a project than thinking about a concept, which for me is an abstract device over here, which might be of some use, but kind of doesn't really engage with the stuff that's there, I feel. So my own work, well, a number of books that I've undertaken which deal explicitly with strategy, and I'm going to use these to describe some of the strategies that I've talked about, and I'll use the work of other people, some of my students in some of these things. But I suppose the number of books, the 3 books that I've done which explicitly deal with strategies are all about how people work with the existing. The first book I ever did with Sally was this one, Rereadings, number 1. That was 15 years ago now. My God, it makes me feel old. Very popular, and now the publishers are useless. Hope there's nobody in the room from the publishers. The RIBA, absolutely useless. 15 years later, or actually about 13 years later, they said, oh, this book's so good, it's been editioned 3 times. Oh, let's do another one. So we did a volume 2, which came out just last year, called Rereadings 2, just when you thought it was safe to go back. My friend rather amusingly called it Reheatings. We used the same structure, but then we repopulated it with all new writing and all new case studies, because we felt that it was still relevant 15 years later. It's a process-based book. And then adaptation strategies I'll talk about in a bit as well. Rereadings was quite successful for us, really, and it essentially falls into 3 main areas. If you're going to work with the existing, if you're going to work with stuff that's already there, you have to devise methods of reading, of understanding what's there already, and we suggest that you do that through the analysis of the existing material. And the analysis of the material can take place in a number of ways. It can be about solid things like form and structure, you know, the forms that are there, the structural devices that are used. It can be about things that are less tangible, such as the history of a building or its previous function. The context, what's around it, as much as important as what's inside of it, the environment, sun, moon, all that sort of stuff. Proposed function, and then we added sustainability in the second version because we felt that in the 15 years this had become a much more critical device that we needed to discuss in your analysis. Then, from the analysis of that material, you formed strategy, and we devised 3: intervention, insertion, installation, and we'll talk about those in a bit. And then from that understanding, you then devise your tactics, okay? These are the things which you use to realize your analysis and your strategies. And they are plane, wall, floor, ceiling, facade, object, can be a piece of furniture, it can be a pair of jeans, it can be a museum, it can be a sculpture in a museum. Light, natural, artificial. Surface. Now, surface is both applied and found, because sometimes you work with a building and the surface existing is really important. Openings, windows, doors, apertures, movement, stairs, bridges, ramps, escalators, elevators, all sorts of stuff. And those are the things that you realise your work with. Now, the most, I think, innovative part of the book was the strategies, and I'm just going to talk about 3. Intervention. When you are working with the existing, sometimes you have to take an approach which is fairly robust, okay? It's falling apart, it needs kind of reworking or rethinking in a drastic way. You can't be delicate with it. So we suggest that intervention is the way that you then act upon the building, the way that you engage with it. So that means cutting, it means removing, it means bashing the thing around. And then the level of integration between your intervention and the existing is they're almost intertwined, okay? They're kind of locked in together. They're not separated, so they rely on each other. That's what an intervention strategy is about. You're working, this is Witherford Watson Mann, Astley Hall in the UK, and you can see the ruin of the building there, the old red brick and the new intervention sitting within that. They're both reliant on each other. They are integrated. You can't have one without the other anymore. That's an intervention. People like Gordon Matter Clark, who you may or may not know, I think is the great interventionist. He'd cut up buildings in order to release new stories and new narratives. The second strategy is insertion, slightly different. When you insert something into, on top of, underneath, beside, around, what you're doing is you're creating an autonomous element which may well be inspired by the existing space, but it's built to fit. Its properties are derived from the existing space. So much like this stair coming through the doorway, that's built to fit that opening in the existing building. So when you insert something into a space, you are dramatically contrasting it with the existing, but at the same time it is built to fit. That's the difference of insertion to intervention. And the third one is installation. So when you install something into a space, you are essentially not touching it. You can use it to hang paintings, sculptures, maybe a pair of jeans in a retail space or something. Maybe a pop-up guerrilla store or something that's there for a short period of time. There's a temporal dimension to installation where you put something in a space and then you take it away and the existing space is left untouched. You can use the existing space to add dramatic effect between the new and the old, but the idea is that, I hope you can see, between the 3, intervention is very much an integral strategy. Insertion is about making something autonomous which is built to fit, and installation, there's barely any relationship between the new and the old. Those were the 3 strategies that we kind of used or we developed in rereadings, and it was a few years later that I felt, I don't know why, why only 3? There's more, there's got to be more in order to help us to engage with existing matter. So in true interior style, one of the only books that I could ever rely on when I was a student, one of 2, was this book on the left, Adaptations by Philippe Robert. And in true interior style, I ripped it off. I decided I'd use that title and appropriate it. I got in touch with Philip. You always. I know it's. I'm on thin ice when I start to tell students to plagiarise stuff and copy stuff, but do it anyway. Nobody cares. I mean, no, I didn't mean that. Copying and plagiarising, brilliant. It's really interesting. Just name your sources, or at least let us know so we can tell how good you are when you're copying stuff. I got in touch with Philippe Robert and said, look, mate, I really love your book and I want to pay homage to it because I'm going to use the title. And he said, yeah, great, thank you. Like any good interiorist. He knows when he's being copied. So I nicked the title and I created adaptation strategies for interior architecture and design. And in essence, it was a kind of a retreading, a furthering of the strategies of reuse and how we reuse and synthesizing kind of like how we approach this. I was fascinated by it and still am. How can we create meaningful spaces through adapting the existing heritage and what we've inherited around us? So there are a number of them. Building on the three that Sally and I devised, intervention, installation and insertion, I thought there were a lot more. Reprogramming, superuse, artifice, narrative, on and off-site. And there's probably still more as well, you know, who knows? There's probably millions out there, but these were the ones that kept kind of coming to me in terms of, or the ones that kept sort of appearing to me in terms of what I thought these projects were really trying to do. So let's talk a little bit more about strategies as a kind of approach to the heritage. Reprogramming a space. Well, reprogramming is something that we all do. You guys earlier showing me your work, you're reprogramming a sort of steel frame garage space into a market hall or a food hall or a bio sort of learning space, I seem to remember. Reprogramming is something that we all do. We put new programs into existing spaces. And sometimes those programs can be completely and utterly at odds with whatever a space was originally devised for. This image on the left here is the House of Air in San Francisco, where the designers made a trampoline park in an old aircraft hangar. The aircraft hangar was riddled with asbestos, poisoned through lots of fuel problems from the old airplanes in the building and stuff like that. So to have kind of kiddies playing in amongst that kind of toxic mess is kind of like quite a challenge to reprogram. But they cleaned up the building, etc., and put this stuff inside of it. But reprogramming can be a kind of, you know, a political act, I would argue, by recharging a building with a completely different use that it was never, ever intended for. This is a long quote, so I won't describe it all to you, but Bourriard wrote a great book called Post-Production, which is one of my favourites, and he talks about artists and creative production today and how all they are doing is just reprogramming what exists already. He talks about the idea that actually, essentially, to paraphrase him, everything's been done already. Okay, the modernist idea of originality and authorship, forget them. It's over. Everything's been done already. And I don't think that's depressing. I think that's really rather exciting. It's kind of a release to know that you don't have to be original. You can't be. What you do is you take existing stuff and you reprogram it, and you recharge it, you recontextualize it, you change it, you adapt it, and it becomes something new. It becomes something different. And Bourriard argues that that's all artists do now. It's just a perpetual trail of reworking what's already out there. And I think that's all we do as interior people. We reprogram existing things, you know, whether it's a bit of infrastructure, whether it's a coal mine, whether it's an old garage which becomes a bank, whether it's the aircraft hangar that becomes the trampoline park. All of these things are just reprogrammed. We put new programs into spaces which were never intended to house them, or nobody thought of that when they were ironically being built. Superuse is a strategy which is really tied in very, very closely to notions of sustainability and reusing stuff. Superuse was a phrase coined in 2012 by some Dutch designers who, you can look them up online. Superuse is a really interesting strategy which is about material adaptation, and in particular being really kind of clear about what materials can do for you, what objects can do for you, and how you can reappropriate them, particularly in their production cycles. So it's kind of like a closed looping kind of approach to work, how you can reconfigure things before they become redundant, if that makes sense. Superuse is about really utilizing things that were never, ever intended for the use for which they're put to. So this image on the left is a film archive in Madrid, which is made primarily out of rubber hosing, you know, hose pipes which you use to water your garden. Or these water containers on the right are stacked up in order to make a new wall. Superuse is derived from the harvest map. There's a great project in Rotterdam which used this kind of superuse approach. And the way that it often happens is that the designers will stick a pin in a map of where the project is. This was in Rotterdam in Holland. Draw a line around, I was going to say a kilometre, but that doesn't mean anything to you. That's about almost a mile, not quite really, about 800 yards or something, around the site. And then what they do is they try and harvest all of the materials for the project from within that diameter of the site. And that's the harvest map, okay? So superuse then becomes about what you find, how you can reuse it, and how you can rework it into a different space. So this was the project in Rotterdam using a superuse strategy. This is kind of quite wild in many respects. So there's textiles which they reuse to make a wall. This is old shelving and bits of timber which they find. This is an old greenhouse which they found in a site which becomes the kitchen for the office. This is a workspace, by the way, and they use crates for lecture space and stuff like that. There's a famous story about this project where they they secured something like 100 doors from this building site nearby, and then left them overnight. And then the next day, and they started, to really think about how they were going to use them. Next day, somebody nicked the lot. And so therefore they had to rethink the whole design. So it's a kind of approach which relies on contingency. That is, what do you find in the area? What do you inherit? What can you pick out from the space around you in order to make new space? So it's really designing on the hoof. And it's kind of, in some respects, it's not too far removed from a design-build approach, I would say, You find something, you start working with it, and you start to adapt it in different ways. Artifice is a wonderful word that if you're using a strategy which is about artifice, what you're really setting out to do is to create deceit, I think, and you're trying to reuse stuff in a way where you're trying to sort of almost deceive or make illusion for the user or the visitor. In the dictionary, artifice is rather lovingly described, I think, as the employment of the art of cunning. Oh, that's quite a nice way of describing it. So if I'm going to be using artifice as an approach to making space, then I'm going to be trying to deceive you and trying to misinform you maybe, or seduce you into thinking something different in a space. This is a pavilion in Holland, again, the Coupe Pavilion, which is a portrait pavilion. And it's in one room of a museum, which is all about 17th and 18th century portraiture. And the new pavilion was designed to house a bunch of selfies from the visitors. So, it's kind of carrying on the theme of portraiture, but trying to bring it into the 21st century. So this image that you see actually contains the pavilion. You can't really see it. It's completely reflective, and it kind of reflects the mirror and mirrors the paintings and the people as they move into this room. It's rather a beautiful thing. I've seen it in the flesh, and it's really quite astounding. It's a bit strange because, you do see people kind of almost bump into it and walk into it because it's kind of pretty much disappeared in the space. It just sits in this room, in this carpet, this pattern in the carpet, so it kind of adopts that form there. And on the inside are a bunch of portraits, and also some people add their selfies to them and stuff like that as well. So it's deceiving. It's using the notion of artifice to sort of somehow deceive us and misinform us. Some spaces that you work with will have incredible stories, okay? Not all of them. Some spaces will have nothing to say. Some spaces have narratives, stories, which are, you cannot avoid them. This This is a way of telling stories about space, and the interior is a very, very good device for that, I would argue, because the interior, in my view, is really, really closely related to people and humans. Or one of the central things of what we are is an interface, I think, between architecture and the human or the body. So sometimes we need to tell stories, and narrative is a strategy which really can transform heritage or inheritance into really quite powerful stories. This is a particularly powerful and tragic story, a project which is in Milan. It's under Milan Central Station. It's designed by Guido Morpurgo and his partner, Isabella De Curtis. And it's an amazing project which has been incredibly difficult to realise because nobody really wants to deal with this. And there's a very unfortunate part of 20th century history which is about the it's about the Holocaust and about the deportation of the Jewish community across Europe in the early part of the 20th century. And there's a little known story about Italy's role in that, and in particular how the train station in Milan, which is this incredible edifice, was used to deport the Jewish community of Milan to Auschwitz. And it did it through what was an incredibly sort of efficient device, which was there's on the side of the train station is the post office. And the post office, at the end of the day would bag up all the post, bring it to the side of the station, stick it on a railway truck, which then was lifted up to the main station and then went out and was distributed around Italy. And so the designers wanted to tell the story of this, that how this system was then used to deport the Jewish community. And it's an incredibly powerful piece of work, but it's a story that nobody wanted to hear. So for years, it's still not open now. They can't finish it because nobody will fund it, nobody will get involved with it. But they've really worked for years on this to try and get people to understand it. So you're met with the wall of indifference as you walk in. This is all under the main station, which is still in operation. So the devastating kind of atmosphere of the place is heightened by the fact that the trains are still rumbling over ahead of you. So, all the time, all you can hear is this sound of trains moving, and it cannot help but take you back to this terrible, tragic story. You come in, you're met by the wall of indifference. Then you're taken on a journey through the space. I won't show you the whole of the space, but there's elements then which tell you, and lists actually, I think it's about 5,000 people who lost their lives through being moved through this environment. This is an image, a render of what they want. They want to make this into a library which houses lots of texts, particularly around the Jewish community in Italy and Milan. This is the condition of it at the moment. They can't get the money to finish it off because nobody wants to get involved. So the point being is some narratives have to be told, but they're very difficult narratives. They're not easy narratives, and some people don't like stories. There are certain stories that some people don't like, certain stories that have to be told. And narrative is a powerful tool, device, instrument when you're working spaces or working with spaces that have strong stories to tell. Final one I'm going to talk about is a strategy which is just merely about building. Sometimes you have to prefabricate things on a site, off a site. Sometimes you will use module things. So here is a project in Spain where the designers found all of these roof tiles which had been stripped off the building, and rather than just kind of waste them and bin them, they utilised them for an interior space. Expedience is king in these kind of projects. And on and off site as a strategy, well, sometimes you just need to build something away from the site and bring it in. Or sometimes there's a module which is really powerful and you want to utilise it. This is People's Architecture Office, and they used Taobao to build their interiors. Do you know what Taobao is? It's the Chinese Amazon. So these are air conditioning units which they buy off the internet. They're delivered there, and then they install them in the space to make interior space. This is a drawing of the project here. This is a bar. So sometimes you have to prefabricate off-site, or something's done remotely and brought to the site. It's a strategy of thinking ahead. It's a strategy of expediency sometimes, but it's also a strategy of thinking about what you need to bring to the site. This is a lovely project which is in Suffolk in the UK, East Anglia. Old dovecot reused by this Core 10 unit, just dropped into space. This is the project, right, that you don't ever want to get the measurements wrong, all right? Because you ain't going to get that in there if you get anything wrong, because it's got to sit in there like that. This is now a little artist's residence. Okay, so to sort of conclude, radical heritages. So heritage, quite often when you say heritage, people consider it to be a kind of something that's a bit old-fashioned. It sounds a bit old-fashioned, doesn't it? When I use the word heritage, quite often people get slightly nervous because they think I'm kind of going to go into a museum where there's kind of reenactments and things like that, and somebody pretending to be in the 18th century or some kind of nonsense like that. That's not really the case. It's about inheritance, and it's about judgment, and it's about value, and it's about deciding what to emphasize in an existing space and also what to suppress. And the thing about strategy is these are the tools to unlock that material. There's an embedded knowledge and an embedded material within all existing buildings, I would argue, and that's the heritage. That's the inheritance that you're dealing with. This is an incredibly long quote, but it's by a good friend of mine and a great writer, Fred Scott, and I like the way he talks about existing buildings. And the final sentence is the key there. The partial demolitions and removals from the host building are in one sense like a shadow being cast of the new work to come. What a beautiful thought. That somehow the new stuff we're going to somehow bring or import into this site is derived from what's there already. It's interlinked. It's a shadow of what's there, which I think is rather a beautiful way of thinking about it. This approach, for me, informs a unique atmosphere because it's just an atmosphere that you don't, or a kind of environment that you just can't reproduce in a new build environment, I would argue. You know, when you're working with the existing, you are working with stories, you're working with material, which each has its own atmosphere and its own set of meanings. And it's up to you as a designer to narrate and illustrate those things. But it's also, and my final point really, is the processes of this, in my view, create this unique sensibility, which I mentioned earlier. Sensibility is a thing which anybody can do this type of work, I think. But you can't do it unless you've got the sensibility. And the sensibility for me is one which is about working with the existing and an excitement about working with the existing as well. For some people, the sight of a blank page, a clean site with nothing on it, is the exciting thing about making stuff in the built environment. For me, that's frightening. And not only is it frightening, I think it's something which is going to occur less and less as we move forward in the 21st century. Because we will always be working with stuff that's already out there. And so that kind of excitement of working with stuff that's already there requires a very particular sensibility. And it's a sensibility which I think is derived from lots of interiors programs, because you're working with stuff. It can be seen in architecture programs as well, landscape, urbanism, anybody. But you must have that sensibility. It doesn't matter how you get it, but you've got to be excited about working with stuff that's already there. To finish, a quote, and I borrow this from a good friend of mine, Ben Kelly, who's one of my mentors. He's a big fan of Marcel Duchamp. And this sensibility that I talk about is an approach which means that anything can be beautiful. And that's a famous quote from Duchamp about how everything has some kind of merit or value, which you then as a designer, if you're working with it, you've then got to work out your approach to it and what you think is worth emphasizing, suppressing, removing, editing, etc. That's radical heritages, and that's the idea of the interior as being a space of inheritance. Thank you very much. Questions?
Yeah, thank you, Graeme. I think we'll open it up to questions for a few minutes here. So if you have a question for Graeme, give me your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
It's Friday. I know, it's pub time. Go on, ask me anything.
Jason's eager.
British food, football teams, pet names.
Oh,
Oh, we got one. Hooray.
got two.
I'm right at the back as well. Go on, Nate. Run.
Up.
Hi, thank
Hello.
you for your lecture. So I had a question about when you're talking about reuse, what do you see as the boundary between starting from scratch and starting with a found object? In the sense that when you're working with a site, when is it new, when is it not new, or with a room or any sort of space or an object? Like, is a brand new chair that you buy or you find, or a system of building like post and beam or something, is that a found object? Or
Interesting.
where is that sort of
Yeah.
boundary?
Yeah, it's a nice question. I don't think there's any hard and fast rule about it, because, like you say, you could give me a piece of landscape, and one could argue that there's a found element there. There's some kind of something on the ground, grass or a tree or whatever. So it's, I suppose, what I'm getting at is more about an approach which is a kind of delight in whatever is on that site that you're working with, which you want to either emphasize or suppress. So if you're working with a completely cleared site, you probably will struggle. There's probably a bit of earth and a perimeter of some kind. It might be quite difficult if you want to kind of start to reuse something because there's hardly anything there. But it depends. If there's something on that site that you enjoy or you think is interesting, I think that's the beginnings of a sensibility about wanting to work with that element, whatever it might be. So I'd say there's no hard and fast rules, but I think I suppose it's about an approach. If there's something on that site that you value or you think's of interest or can tell a story or you think you want to incorporate it into the work you're doing, then that requires a way of thinking which I think is different to just going, okay, yeah, I've got this plot of land, off we go.
You were saying in 30 years you don't see new construction being as prevalent anymore.
Yeah.
That being said, do you see architects getting more of a sensibility about interior design or becoming obsolete?
No, I don't think it's not about obsolescence. It's more about a sort of development of a sensibility, really. I suppose, if we really want to historicise this, one might argue that the early 20th century, particularly around ideas of modernity, was very much about the tabula rasa, wiping the slate clean and starting again. And I suppose what I'm arguing for or suggesting is that, that's kind of not relevant anymore. And not only is it not relevant, we just can't afford that, I don't think, anymore. So it's not about the obsolescence of any profession. It's more about people thinking more about just, rather than wiping the slate clean, thinking about the value of stuff and how it might become useful to them in their design work. That's really where it's at. I don't advocate the obsolescence of anybody or any profession. So sometimes I know I might come across as a bit polemical about architecture and interiors, and I get that. I think it's probably for years of being in an office with architects where they kind of chuck a cushion at you and say, oh, you do the cushions, or you're the inferior designer, So I got a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that. But no, I don't advocate this kind of disappearance of any profession. I think it's more about the acquisition of this sensibility.
Other questions? Okay, let's thank Graeme again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.